Are you ready to face what lurks in the mirror? The room was cold, a chill that clung to the air, biting through the layers of clothing. The clock on the wall ticked, each second dragging on, stretching time like rubber. The soft hum of a distant fan was the only other sound. The silence felt heavy, like something was lurking just beyond the edges of perception. Evelyn sat in the corner, her back pressed against the wall. Her eyes darted around the room. The walls seemed to close in with every breath. There was something wrong, something off. She glanced at the door, half expecting it to swing open, the figure of her late husband standing in the doorway, his shadow stretching across the floor. But it didn't. The room was empty. A sharp click echoed through the stillness. Evelyn froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. She could almost taste the fear in the air. Her breath quickened. Her gaze fell to the small window by the desk. The streetlights outside flickered, casting strange shadows that danced on the walls. She couldn't move, her body stiff, her limbs frozen in place. The sound came again, a faint rustling, a shift in the air. She wasn't alone. Evelyn's fingers curled into fists. She strained to hear, to make sense of the noise. It wasn't her imagination. Something was there, watching her. Her pulse thudded in her ears. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The floor creaked under the weight of something moving. Closer, a faint breath. So close she could feel it on her skin. Her legs shook beneath her, but she forced herself to stand. She had to move, had to get out. But when she turned toward the door, she froze. There, in the doorway, stood a figure, tall, cloaked in darkness. Its eyes were voids, hollow. It reached for her, slow and deliberate. Evelyn's scream caught in her throat. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The figure stepped forward, closer. A cold hand brushed her cheek. Her knees buckled beneath her. She crumpled to the floor. The last thing she saw was the empty, lifeless eyes staring down at her. Then nothing. The air was thick, suffocating. Darkness pressed in on all sides. Evelyn's mind raced. Her body was frozen, paralyzed with terror. She tried to move, to escape, but her limbs refused to obey. The figure loomed over her, towering, its presence consuming the room. The silence was deafening now, oppressive. The only sound was her frantic heartbeat, pounding in her ears. Then the figure spoke. Its voice was a whisper, a cold, rasping sound, like the scrape of a blade on stone. "I've been waiting for you." Evelyn's chest tightened. Her breath was shallow. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Who are you?" Her voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it tilted its head, like it was studying her. Its hollow eyes never left hers. "Does it matter?" it said, its voice chillingly calm. "You should have known. You should have never come here." A sudden surge of panic flooded her veins. Her mind scrambled for an explanation, for a way out. The memories came crashing back. The investigation, the secrets, the lies, her husband's death, the dark truths she had uncovered, things she had never shared with anyone, the people who didn't want her to know. The figure moved closer, and Evelyn's stomach twisted. It was too close now. She could feel the cold radiating from it, could almost smell the decay on its breath. "Did you really think you could escape?" it hissed, a twisted grin forming on its face. Her legs trembled beneath her as she struggled to push herself up. Her fingers brushed the floor, reaching for anything that could protect her. But it was too late. The figure reached down, grabbing her wrist with unnatural strength. "You should have stayed in the dark," it whispered. And then there was nothing. No sound, no movement, no breath. Just an endless, suffocating silence. The silence was maddening. Evelyn's senses had gone numb. The world around her seemed to disappear, swallowed by a void. She could no longer feel the cold grip on her wrist. Couldn't hear her own ragged breathing. Everything stopped. Time had stretched too far, warped beyond recognition. Then, a faint sound broke the stillness. A whisper, barely audible. "Wake up." Her eyes snapped open. The room was gone. She was no longer on the cold floor, staring into those lifeless eyes. She wasn't in the house anymore. She was somewhere else, somewhere unfamiliar. Her body felt heavy, weighted down. She struggled to lift her head, to make sense of where she was. The walls around her were dark, but there were no shadows, no flickering lights, no eerie figure lurking in the corner, just emptiness. The ground beneath her was smooth, metallic. A low hum resonated through the air, vibrating through her bones. Evelyn's heart began to race once more. Where was she? What was happening? Her breath quickened as the panic returned, clawing at her throat. "Stay calm," a voice said. It was clear now, steady, cold. The same voice she had heard before, but this time it didn't come from the figure. It came from somewhere inside her, a voice she recognized, her own, but it wasn't her. She tried to speak, to ask what was going on, but her lips wouldn't move. Her throat was dry, and the walls, they were closing in. A flicker of light, a door, far ahead, glowing faintly. Evelyn didn't know how, but somehow she was moving toward it, step by slow step. Her body was not her own. The closer she got, the more the humming grew, louder now, almost deafening. And the closer she got, the more she felt someone watching her. Watching from behind, from every angle. She reached the door, her hand trembling as it touched the cold handle. The door swung open, but instead of freedom, she saw a reflection. Her own eyes, but twisted, dark, hollow. The reflection smiled, and Evelyn screamed. The scream echoed in her ears, but it felt distant, like someone else was crying out. Beat raced. She had to get away. She had to escape. But when she turned to run, her legs wouldn't move. Frozen, stuck. She couldn't breathe. A sharp, searing pain shot through her chest. She gasped for air, her vision blurring. The door slammed shut behind her. Trapped. The hum of the room intensified, filling every corner, every crevice of her mind. She couldn't think, couldn't escape. She spun around again, her panic clawing at her throat. That figure, it wasn't just a reflection. It was alive, and it was coming for her. Her hands pressed against the walls, trying to steady herself, but they were slick, damp, like they were made of something wrong. Something that was pulling at her, dragging her back. The floor seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen force. It swayed beneath her, stretching, warping. The figure in the reflection was moving now. Its eyes never left her. It stepped closer, its twisted smile growing. "You should have stayed," it whispered, the words slipping into her mind like ice. Evelyn's stomach churned. She couldn't fight it. She was being drawn in. She could feel the walls closing around her. The air thickened, became harder to breathe. And then it was too late. The walls shifted, closing in faster than she could comprehend. The room folded into itself, trapping her in a suffocating, endless loop. The figure reached through the mirror, its hands, no, its claws grabbing at her, dragging her closer. Her scream was swallowed by the dark, and Evelyn vanished. The darkness swallowed her whole. There was no air, no light, no sound. Only the crushing weight of nothingness pressing down on her. Her thoughts scattered like shards of glass, breaking apart, leaving only fragments of fear. Her body seemed to dissolve, to lose shape, to become nothing more than a fleeting sensation, a memory. Then, suddenly, a sharp jolt, like waking from a nightmare. Evelyn gasped, the breath tearing at her lungs, and she shot upright. Her hands gripped the ground beneath her. She was on the floor again, her vision blurred, but the sharp smell of something metallic filled the air. Slowly, her eyes adjusted. The room was familiar. She was back in the house. The same cold room. The same ticking clock. The same empty walls. But there was something different. A sense of foreboding. Her skin crawled. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she touched her face, feeling the heat of her own skin, the pulse of her own blood. She was alive, but it didn't feel right. The room, once cold, now felt suffocating, like the air itself was heavy, thick with something unseen, something watching. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she forced herself to stand. Her legs were weak, unsteady beneath her. The door. She needed to reach the door. She had to get out. But the moment she turned, her stomach twisted. There, standing in the doorway, was the figure. The same hollow eyes. The same twisted grin. The reflection from the mirror. It stepped forward, its presence filling the room, suffocating the air. "You're mine now," it whispered, its voice cold and hollow. Evelyn's heart froze. The door behind her slammed shut, trapping her once again. The figure reached out, its hand brushing her cheek, cold as ice. Her mind screamed. Her body froze. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It was too late. The figure's eyes bore into hers, and in that moment, Evelyn knew the truth. She wasn't escaping. She never had. Evelyn's pulse hammered in her chest, louder than ever, as the figure's hand lingered near her skin. Cold, unnatural, like death itself. The room swirled. Her head spun. Her breath quickened. But her body was paralyzed, as if time itself had frozen. She tried to scream, but her voice was gone. Her throat ached, constricted. All she could hear was the low hum of the darkness, filling her mind, erasing her thoughts. The figure stepped closer. She could feel its presence, like a shadow wrapping itself around her, smothering her. "You should have understood," it murmured, its voice like the scrape of nails on a chalkboard. "You were never meant to leave." A chilling laugh echoed from it. Evelyn's legs gave out, and she crumpled to the floor, unable to fight, unable to move. Her mind raced, desperate for any way to escape. Asterisk how can I get away from this? Asterisk. But it was no use. The room pressed in on her from all sides. She was trapped. The figure leaned down, its face inches from hers. "I was always here," it whispered. Waiting, the air thickened. She couldn't breathe. With a sudden, violent force, it grabbed her by the wrist, yanking her up. She felt herself dragged toward the mirror, the one she had seen it in. Her body jerked and twisted, as if her limbs no longer obeyed her. "No, no," she screamed in her mind, but her mouth wouldn't cooperate. The reflection in the mirror was hers, but not. Her face was distorted, twisted into something dark and monstrous, and it was smiling back at her, as if it knew the truth. Her reflection reached out, its hand pressing against the glass. Evelyn could feel the cold touch against her own skin. Her reflection moved, its lips curling into that grin, its eyes hollow and empty. "You're just like me now," the figure said, its voice low, venomous. Evelyn tried to pull away, but she was trapped. She couldn't escape. Her own reflection, her own twisted self, reached out to pull her in, and in that moment she realized there was no escape, not from it, not from herself. With one final, desperate gasp, Evelyn was dragged into the glass. The door to the room slammed shut, and the house fell silent. The silence was suffocating. Outside the house, the world carried on, unaware of the darkness that had consumed it. Inside, the walls seemed to pulse with an energy of their own. The room was empty now, save for the mirror that hung on the far wall. The reflection was still there, but there was no longer a difference. Evelyn's twisted form stared back at her, eyes empty, mouth stretched in that chilling grin. The air had grown heavier, thicker with an unseen presence. There was no sound, not even the ticking of the clock. Everything was still, and then, from deep within the house, another sound broke the silence. A soft, uneven breath, slow, labored. It grew louder, filling the space around the mirror. Was it her? No, it wasn't. The mirror trembled, as if it could feel the shift in the air. And then, slowly, a hand pressed against the glass from the inside. A face began to form. Evelyn's face, but it wasn't her. Not anymore. The reflection blinked. It smiled. The house was never empty. It had never been. And now there was no way to escape. The walls, the darkness, the mirror, they all knew. Empty. Devoid of life. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to bend, warping as if the house itself was breathing in sync with the creature that had just taken form. Evelyn's body, asterisk her own body asterisk, stood motionless by the wall, but the reflection was alive in ways she never was again. The figure turned its head toward her. A slow smile curled across its lips, an imitation of a smile, but twisted, cruel. "Did you think you could run?" it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. Evelyn's heart lurched, her breath shallow, as she realized what it meant. She wasn't free. She was never going to be free. The creature, the reflection of her, stepped closer, its presence suffocating. It reached for her with cold, elongated fingers. "You are mine," it said. "Always. Forever." Her chest tightened. Her limbs felt numb, her body paralyzed in the same way it had been when she first saw the figure. She wanted to scream. She wanted to fight, but she couldn't. The room, the house, had a power of its own now, and it was swallowing her whole. Her reflection, her twisted double, lifted its hand and touched her face. The chill spread, seeping through her skin like ice, numbing her from the inside out. The creature's eyes locked with hers, and in that instant, Evelyn saw what had happened. It wasn't just her face, her body, that had been claimed. It had taken her soul, and now there was nothing left. As the reflection drew her closer, the air around her grew heavy, thick with the scent of decay. Her surroundings began to blur. The walls melted away, the floor dissolved beneath her feet. Everything was slipping into darkness. The house was alive, and so was the reflection. She was trapped, not in the house, not in the mirror, but in herself. And the reflection, her own twisted version, was free to roam, to haunt. The last thing Evelyn felt was the cold, a suffocating, endless cold. And then nothing, the nothingness stretched on, endless and suffocating. There was no sound, no light, no warmth. Evelyn's mind, or what was left of it, drifted in a fog, a haze. Her body was gone, dissolved into the dark. But her consciousness remained, suspended in a void. Time had lost all meaning here. But then something stirred, a crack, a faint light, a pulse. Evelyn's senses, dulled by the emptiness, slowly began to sharpen. She could feel something, a presence, but not the reflection. No, it was different. The pulse of energy grew stronger. It flickered like a distant heartbeat, steady, insistent. She could feel it drawing her in. Her mind, though fractured, felt a stir of recognition. Someone else is here. Her thoughts, fragmented and weak, struggled to make sense of it. She tried to reach for the pulse, to grasp it, to use it to pull herself from this endless abyss. The light brightened, sharper now, flickering with urgency. Is it real? A distant voice, like a whisper carried on a breeze, barely audible. Evelyn. The sound of her name broke through the fog. A faint, distant memory of the life she had once lived. The life that was now a distant echo. But it was not enough to save her. The voice came again. Closer. Evelyn, don't. The words fractured, breaking apart like glass, as if they too were being pulled into the darkness. Her heart raced, or what was left of it. It beat wildly in her chest, as if fighting for its life. The pulse intensified, almost unbearable now. She was being dragged towards it, drawn helplessly to its source. But it was not salvation. It was a trap. The light flared, and in that instant, Evelyn realized what it was. A reflection. Her reflection. It had followed her, tracked her down in the void, feeding off her fear, her despair. She tried to pull away, but it was too late. The light grew blinding, and her reflection stepped through it, closer, closer still. No longer just a twisted imitation of herself. It had grown, morphed, become something far more dangerous. It was now in control, and it would never let her go. The light faded to black, and in the endless darkness, Evelyn's scream was the last thing that remained. Silent, lost. Forever the darkness pressed in tighter, suffocating Evelyn's fading consciousness. But this time, she wasn't alone. The pulse, once distant, now vibrated through her very being, rattling her fragile existence. It had consumed her, twisted her, and yet it beckoned again. It wanted her, needed her, and though she tried to resist, her mind, weak and fractured, couldn't escape. The reflection stood before her, its shape no longer human. It had taken on an unfamiliar form, something both ancient and new, a grotesque fusion of shadow and glass. It was like the house itself had shaped it from every forgotten nightmare, every piece of her fractured soul. The reflection smiled again. No, it grinned, the kind of grin that promised agony. "You're mine now," it said, its voice echoing in her ears, both familiar and alien at once. "I've always been here." Evelyn's mind scrambled, fighting to hold on to any shred of herself. She wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but the words never formed. Her body betrayed her. Her limbs, her voice, nothing responded. Her reflection leaned closer, its eyes empty pits of despair. "Don't you see? You were never meant to leave. You thought you could escape me, escape us." It reached out, its hand brushing against her skin. The touch was cold, but not just cold. It was frozen, as if it carried the weight of all the years spent waiting, watching, haunting. Evelyn's skin burned where it touched her, and then an unbearable chill spread from her heart to her fingertips, as though her very essence was being siphoned away. She wasn't merely trapped in the mirror anymore. She wasn't in the house, or even in her own mind. She was part of it. The reflection was inside her now. Evelyn's vision blurred, the edges of her consciousness slipping further away. She could no longer tell what was real, what was memory, what was nightmare. Her reflection loomed larger, swallowing the last pieces of her will, her identity. And then, just as the darkness seemed to claim her completely, the reflection whispered, a final cruel twist in its voice. "You were always a part of me." The last of Evelyn's thoughts shattered into fragments, her soul sinking into the void. And in the depths of that darkness, something new stirred. The reflection smiled, and Evelyn was no more. The void was silent, but something was shifting. An unsettling, ever-present awareness filled the space where Evelyn's existence once was. It was like a cold wind brushing over her, a flicker of something trying to find its shape, its form. But there was no body to grasp, no mind to pull together. Only the lingering echo of a presence and the pulse. The reflection, asterisk her asterisk reflection, had become something else entirely. It stretched far beyond the confines of the mirror. It was no longer bound by glass, by walls, by the limitations of the house. It was free, but more than that, a flicker of movement in the space, a distortion in the shadows. And then it whispered, a voice that was not its own. Not just one voice, but 1,000 voices all twisting together. Asterisk, I am everything. Asterisk. The walls began to crack, splintering under the weight of its presence. The house, once a place of memories, of pain, of terror, now seemed to buckle beneath the force that had been unleashed. The reflection had become the house. It had become the darkness that had consumed it all. Every inch of the space hummed with power, every shadow a reminder of the twisted figure that was born from Evelyn's soul. Outside, the night sky shifted, clouds swirling in unnatural patterns, as if the very world was unraveling. The house, with all its secrets, stood at the center of it, its foundation no longer stable, its walls no longer holding the fragile remnants of what had been. The pulse of the reflection grew louder, and for the first time in a long while, there was a flicker of something human in the void. A single, desperate thought. Was there any escape left? But the answer came swiftly, cold, and final. There was none. The reflection was everywhere now, and Evelyn, she was gone. Forever, the house continued to tremble, the walls buckling under the weight of something far more ancient than any of them could comprehend. The air thickened, laden with the stench of decay and something colder, darker, like the abyss itself had crept into the space. Outside, the world beyond the house flickered. It seemed distant now, irrelevant, as though the very fabric of reality itself was slipping, unspooling. The sky, once full of stars, now pulsed with unnatural, sickly light. The clouds churned in patterns too perfect to be natural, swirling around the house like an encircling storm. The reflection, no longer a mere shadow of Evelyn, had expanded, consuming everything in its wake. It wasn't just an entity anymore. It was the house. It was the earth. It was the air. It was everything, from the cracks in the walls, the shadows that crept along the floor, the very corners of the room. The reflections spoke. The voices, a cacophony of 1,000 whispers, all merged into one. I was always here, it breathed, the words spreading across the space like smoke, winding their way into Evelyn's deepest memories. I was always you. The house groaned as if it were alive, struggling to contain the force now coursing through it. The once comforting corners, the once familiar spaces, now twisted and distorted, as if the house itself had become a reflection of something far worse than it had ever been before. There was no escape, no way to fight back. Evelyn had become nothing more than a memory, a whispered echo lost in the labyrinth of her own soul. The reflection stretched further, its shape flickering like a shadow with no source, like smoke dissipating into the air, unable to be contained by anything. And then, in the silence that followed, the final echo of its voice whispered through the darkness. You will never leave. Not now. Not ever. And in that moment, Evelyn's voice, the last shred of who she had been, whispered back. Not in the house. Not in the world. But in the depths of the reflection's own being. I am you. And just like that, the reflection became the only truth. The last remnant of Evelyn, lost in the dark of the house, now nothing more than a hollow shell, pulsed with a rhythm that seemed to come from deep within its very bones. The walls were no longer solid, but fluid, warping and shifting with every breath the house took. Outside, the storm raged, but it didn't matter anymore. The house had become its own universe, its own prison, and the reflection had become its god. In the center of it all stood the mirror, the only thing left that remained a semblance of the life Evelyn once knew. But even that was fading, its surface rippling like water, disturbed by an unseen hand. The reflection inside the glass no longer resembled Evelyn, not in any way she had ever remembered herself. Her features were twisted, a grotesque distortion of the woman who had once been full of life. Her eyes, once full of fear and desperation, were now cold, calculating, lifeless. It had taken her completely. The reflection smiled, a smile that spread across its face, like it was savoring every second of its victory. "You thought you could fight it," it whispered, the voice a hollow echo of the one Evelyn had once had. "You were never meant to escape." And with that, the figure stepped forward from the glass, crossing into the room as if the boundaries of space and time no longer applied. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, its body shifting and warping with every step. It wasn't just Evelyn anymore. It was a part of everything. The house, the reflection, the nightmare. The air grew colder, and the very atmosphere seemed to press in on Evelyn, now lost within the reflection's grasp. Her mind, shattered and broken, could no longer comprehend what was real, what had happened. There was no Evelyn anymore, only the reflection. The house had become its own prison, and the reflection, its ruler. The darkness grew deeper, thicker, and in the endless night, there was no escape, no salvation. The last remnants of Evelyn were swallowed whole, and the reflection smiled. Forever the house, once teeming with life, now stood silent in the oppressive dark. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie stillness that pressed against every corner, every surface. The air was heavy with an unspoken weight, as if the world itself had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something. Inside the house, the mirror shimmered with an unnatural light. It no longer reflected the rooms behind it. Instead, it displayed a stillness, a cold emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever. The once familiar face of Evelyn was gone, replaced by an absence that filled the space with a sense of finality. The reflection, no longer bound by glass or form, hovered at the edge of the room. It was no longer a thing of shadows and whispers. It had become something more, an entity of its own, an embodiment of everything Evelyn had feared and longed to escape. It stood tall, its figure flickering like the last embers of a dying fire, a strange blend of darkness and light, as if it existed on the cusp of reality and dream. But it was not a victory. The reflection gazed into the room, its hollow eyes searching the empty spaces where Evelyn once stood. And in those eyes, there was a flicker of something, an understanding, a recognition, and perhaps a sadness. For the reflection was not just the absence of Evelyn. It was her, too. In a quiet breath, the mirror began to fade, its surface no longer reflecting anything, as if the very idea of reflection had dissolved. The house seemed to exhale, the walls no longer shifting, no longer pulsing with the energy that had once defined it. And in that stillness, a single thought lingered in the air. It was over. The house was empty, not just of people, but of all things that once made it a place of warmth, of life. All that remained was the echo of what had been, the faintest trace of Evelyn's existence lingering like a shadow in the corner of the room. The reflection, now absorbed into the silence, was no longer a threat. It was simply gone, and the world outside, unaware, continued to turn, end,